Hello everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys. Hope you're well today. Releasing this video a little later than usual because I had to attend to some business. But I'm glad to be able to make the video anyway with this half hour or hour delay. We shall see. Now today I'm going to be responding to a question by a viewer called Silent, who was asking me an email what are the main differences between INFJ and ENTP, because he himself or she herself wonders if she might be one or the other. Before I move on to my topic, just remember that I've got 2 books out at the moment, released in the last year. The Ecstatic Soul and the Infinite Castle. This one is a work of non-fiction, exploration of the INFJ type. This one is a novel. And if you support me, these are also good books, getting good reviews, so I would appreciate your support. All the links down below in the description box. Right, so INFJ, NTP. First of all, it might be surprising to some viewers that these types could be a source of confusion in terms of knowing which one you are. But in fact, for the last few years at least, I have thought that the ENTP and the INFJ types were quite a bit closer than one might think, and therefore that the reasons for not being certain that one might be ENTP or INFJ are legitimate reasons, and it's worth remembering, because I think I've rehearsed those differences before, but it's always worth remembering what they are. So first of all, what is the commonality that may explain why someone might not be certain whether they are ENTP or INFJ? If you think about it, okay, try to think about it this way. How many types in the 16 type system, broadly speaking, how many types are intuitive dominance, TI users with TI not in an inferior position, and FE users with FE not in an inferior position? Well, the answer is there's only 2 types. There's INFJ and there's ENTP. Because if you think about other intuitive dominance, INTJ obviously not on the FETI axis, and ENFP similarly, and also at least with regard to INFJ, any dominance. So the ENTP, yes, is any dominant, but still intuitive dominance, just like the INFJ, can display proficient use of TI like the INFJ, can display proficient use of FE like the INFJ. So when you think about these commonalities, you understand a little better why someone might be confused, because someone might think, I'm a little bit ambiverted. I have traits of extroversion and traits of introversion. INFJ, relatively extroverted introverts on average. ENTP, relatively introverted extroverts on average. So again, you have the center, which is a pure ideal ambiversion, which doesn't really exist, but the ENTP would be, if you think about it, the ENTP would be just like a little bit toward extroversion on average, and the INFJ a little bit toward introversion, so not that far apart on that axis. Then you'd have the question of FE and TI, how they relate with each other. It's true that in the case of the INFJ, FE is supposed to be more prominent than TI. In the case of the NTP, it's the reverse. But someone might very well think, well, I'm TI heavy. What if I'm not an ENTP, but a high TI INFJ? Or what if I am an ENTP with high FE rather than an INFJ? So here we have both our commonalities, are the points which explain why those types are possibly confused, and more often than we might think. But they're also the areas where, with further refinement and further definition, we can get to a better understanding of what the differences are. Now, NE versus NI. How does that manifest? Because Silent was asking me this question about this type, and I think that trying to explain the differences, not ultimately in terms of functional differences, but maybe more in terms of practical differences, could be more useful, and could be understood more readily. So in the case of NE dominance and in the case of NI dominance, we have some very clear phenomenal differences, that is, functional differences as they are manifested in everyday behavior. So one such difference, and is perhaps the most prominent one that I want to raise here, because that difference alone should be enough to determine whether you're at any rate a extroverted perception dominant, and not an introverted perception dominant, is the fact that when an ENTP, like any extroverted perceiving dominant, expresses themselves, because of the nature of NE, they are building on the argument of what they're saying. They're building on their point as they go along. It's something that you will encounter all the time with NE dominance. It is that you get the sense that they are making their point as they go, and it's only by the time they're finished that the wholeness of the points that they wanted to make is expressed. And it can in fact follow different possible routes. In other words, because it's going incrementally from one stage to the next as they're talking or as they're writing, the whole might have a different nature than even what they had expected, because they're not in control from the very beginning of what the general point is going to be. A lot of the time it builds itself as it goes. That's direct result of the fact that NE is a function that gathers information in the external environment. When an ENTP makes a point and they start uttering the first few sentences, those sentences are uttered. Once they have been uttered, they become part of the environment that the ENTP can then gather to build from. Even if they're their own sentences, once they have been externalized, they become part of the data to be gathered. So you get this kind of incremental building of the entire viewpoint, and it can go in a lot of different tangential directions, which may be hard to follow for some people, particularly people who don't have high extrovert perceiving function use. In the case of an NI dominance, that's very different. It's very different because, roughly speaking, an NI dominant is a lot more deliberate and controlled in how they express themselves. It does not happen to an NI dominant to proceed like an NE dominant, like an ENTP does. They usually have internalized the whole point in their heads before they even speak it. It is true that when they're speaking, they might bring refinements to what they're saying and refine it. And there's also an incremental process. There's an incremental buildup happening in the case of the NI dominance. It's not of the same nature, though. It's not about the different parts adding up until they get to some kind of complete whole. The whole is there at the start. The refinements that happen in the course of the exposition are actually like you picture a painting, okay, and you imagine that the painting is completely blurred. The more the NI user speaks, the more they express themselves in writing and speaking, writing or speaking, let's say, the better the resolution of the painting becomes. But it's this very same painting all along. It's just the resolution becomes clearer. So they're perfecting the level of resolution by bringing more elements. Whereas in the case of an ENTP, it's more like it's not a painting that's blurred and then becomes clear. It's like little pieces of a puzzle. All of them are clear, but they're not whole. They're not a whole painting. the painting only comes to life when all the different any pieces have come together, and so creates a whole painting. So instead of it being a whole and becoming clearer, it's more broken into lots of different pieces, like a puzzle, and it being all sorted together to create the final picture. And I think that analogy alone should help you plenty in understanding whichever you are, because these are very, very different processes, and I think that it'd be very hard for someone to relate to both. Okay. Now, the other difference that we can briefly mention is the difference between FETI and TIFE. Ultimately, FETI being the auxiliary and tertiary of the INFJ, TIFE being the auxiliary tertiary of the ENTP. Now, here is what would be useful for you to bring home today after this video. In this respect, you could certainly have an ENTP with more visible FE than an INFJ's FE, and an INFJ with more visible TI than an ENTP's TI. But here, I think that, to understand the difference, in the case of FE, you'll always get the impression that even if an ENTP shows a lot of FE, it will always be more childlike. The INFJ's FE is much more adult. It's more serious, okay? The ENTP's FE is more childlike, more playful, more naive. I mean that in the best possible sense. The INFJ's FE is more adult, more controlled, more deliberate in its harmonizing tendencies. So here, the difference is really between the adult and the child, if you like, between those two poles. The child, I'm talking about symbols here, right? I'm not saying the ENTP is a child and the INFJ is an adult. Symbols. The child's advantages the adult doesn't have: spontaneity, naivety, curiosity. The adult has other advantages: discipline, deliberateness, control. And so FE manifests in these different ways. Now, for the TI function, well, that's the exact opposite. So what you'll tend to see is that ENTPs are more, when they use TI, and this might not be completely obvious at first, because since their TI is subordinate to their NE, and their NE is very creative and spontaneous, it might seem as if their TI is the same, because it seems to take on the qualities of their NE. But in fact, the TI of an ENTP tends to have these more adult-like traits that you see in the FE of an INFJ. And conversely, the TI of the INFJ, the TI child, has the traits that you see in the FE of the ENTP. So often INFJs will be fascinated by logical paradoxes, but they will not be necessarily concerned to try to solve them. They will try to look for symbolic meaning behind these paradoxes. They're fascinated by the fact that there are such things, almost like a child is in awe of, something that they cannot quite make sense of. But instead of saying, okay, there's a contradiction, let's resolve it with a TI scale, sometimes they'll just try to work around it, their little world of symbolic imagery. Whereas for an ENTP, this would be unthinkable. They are here, very much like the INTP, to solve the problem. So hopefully this video was useful to Silent and to others among you who may hesitate between two types, in the case of yourself or in the case of maybe one of your friends. Let me know if you thought this exposition was useful, and if you agree with it, if you don't agree with it. If you have something to add, please share in the comments. I always read the comments, as you know. And don't forget my Patreon. Still, my Patreon page is linked below if you want to support me. That would be much appreciated. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, guys. Bye-bye.